We need government to incentivize the progress of the arts and sciences and to protect our intellectual property. Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp, this is my shitty Honda Fit, and that is the state of excuses for intellectual property law. Property. Just regular, everyday property. It's the notion that an individual or group ought to have the right to determine how some given thing is used. Intellectual property, on the other hand, as implied by copyright and patent law, is the notion that an individual or group ought to have the right to determine how an idea is used. It should be noted, though, that the analogy between intellectual property and just property is just that, an analogy. There are many important differences between the two, which I'll mostly get into later, but for now let's just focus on one of those differences, the justification. The justification for regular, everyday property, just things, property, is that there are a limited number of things in the world, and we all have different uses for those things. Therefore, there needs to be some kind of system for us to determine whose use each thing is going to be put to. Okay, ideas, on the other hand, they're not limited, at least not in the same way. We can both use the same idea at the same time. When you use my idea, that doesn't mean I no longer have my idea, right? When you use my beer, then you have to deprive me of that beer to do so. That's the difference. Therefore, the justification for intellectual property has to be somewhat different. And traditionally, at least originally, it has been to encourage the creation of new ideas. You see, society advances in any field in a cumulative fashion. We build our ideas upon the existing stock of ideas that came before us, ideas that other people already laid down. That existing stock of ideas on which you're free to build, in the language of intellectual property, is called public domain. The idea is that people won't contribute to the public domain because they don't benefit from doing so. If you write a song and release it to the public, then anyone can perform it. Or distribute copies of the audio, and therefore, the argument goes, you won't make any money. If you develop some new manufacturing technology and release that to the public domain, you can use that method of manufacturing, sure, but so can everyone else, and they don't have to cover the costs of developing the new technology in the first place, and therefore, the argument goes, you won't be able to compete with them, and so you won't make any money. The solution of intellectual property is to grant the original creator of the idea exclusive rights to use, benefit from, and profit from that idea for a limited period. After that a limited period, sufficient amount of time has passed for the creator to benefit from his work, the idea is released into the public domain for others to build on, and for society to benefit from. It would probably help at this point to go into a little bit of history. Patent law might date back as far as about 500 BC in a town called Sybaris in what is now southern Italy, but was then Greek-controlled. There was this 3rd century Greek historian called Philakis, whose works haven't survived to present day, but who we do know about because he was cited by a number of other Greek writers from the time, and some of their works have survived. One such instance is in a work called the Deipnosophistae. Don't tell me I'm butchering all that pronunciation, by the way. No one knows how that shit was pronounced. There were no recordings back then. Anyway, the relevant part from the Deipnosophistae is when Arthenius said that Philakis had said that in what was already then ancient Sybaris, that if any confectioner or cook invented any peculiar and excellent dish, no other artist was allowed to make this for a year, but he alone who invented it was entitled to all the profit to be derived from the manufacture of it for that time, in order that others might be induced to labour at excelling in such pursuits. And so, looking as far back as we possibly can in the historical record, the justification for patent law was clear. In order that others might be induced to labour at excelling in such pursuits. It was not based on the idea that someone could in some sense own an idea, nor that others who were using that idea were stealing from them. Instead, it was a practically minded effort to encourage more contributions to the public domain, by keeping new ideas out of the public domain for 1 year. The next historical example of patents I want to look at is what is often cited as the beginning of modern patent law, the Venetian Statute of 1474, which stated, "We have among us men of great genius, apt to invent and discover ingenious devices, and in view of the grandeur and virtue of our city, more such men come to us from diverse parts. Now, if provision were made for the works and devices discovered by such persons, so that others who may see them could not build on them and take the inventor's honour away, more men would then apply their genius, would discover, and would build devices of great utility and benefit to our commonwealth. Therefore, be it enacted by the authority of this council, every person who shall build any new and ingenious device in this city, not previously made in this commonwealth, shall give notice of it to the office of our General Welfare Board when it has been reduced to perfection, so that it can be used and operated, it being forbidden to every other person in any of our territories and towns to make any further device conforming with and similar to said one, without the consent and license of the author, for the term of 10 years. This was clearly still justified by the goal of incentivizing the development of new ideas, but there's one little phrase there that hints at the shape of things to come. And take the inventor's honor away. Patent law had been around for long enough that there was some sense of honor associated with the ideas to which you claim exclusive rights. Additionally, the focus here, moving away from the claimed practical benefits of patent law to the tying of a man's sense of honor to the ideas for which he's credited, non-coincidentally comes with a lengthening of the term for patent from 1 year in our last example to 10 years in this one. I say that this is probably non-coincidental because if you think it's wrong to just copy someone else's work on a moral level, then the extension of the duration of copyright or patent is natural. In fact, benefiting from someone else's intellectual labor without their permission, if that's just fundamentally wrong, then arguably copyright and patents should never expire. However, if your purpose for copyright and patent law is simply a mechanism by which we can encourage men to create new works, you'll want the term to be as short as possible, while still providing the necessary incentive, of course. This is so that the work can be quickly added to the public domain and freely built upon by other people. And so, the original creator is incentivized to keep on creating, rather than just sitting back and raking in royalties from his previous work. Going even further along to what is often considered to be the first copyright law, we have the Statute of Anne from England in 1710. The full title reads, "An act for the encouragement of learning, by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors or purchasers of such books during the times therein mentioned." So, still focusing on the practical justification, however, the few lines right after that show the encroachment of the other justification, the alleged moral justification. Whereas printers, booksellers, and other persons of late frequently have taken the liberty of printing, reprinting, and publishing, or causing to be printed, reprinted, and published, books and other writings, without the consent of the authors or proprietors of such books and writings, to their very great detriment, and too often the ruin of them and their families, for preventing, therefore, such practices for future, and for the encouragement of learned men to compose and write useful books, may it please your majesty, that it may be enacted, and it be enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty, yada yada yada, ooh, ain't the Queen fucking fancy, the author, blah blah blah, shall have the sole right and liberty of printing such book and books for the term of 21 years. So you see there that despite being primarily focused on the encouragement of learned men to compose and write useful books, that law is clearly treating intellectual property as though it were a physical property which could be stolen and thus harming the owner of that intellectual property. I imagine that you're getting sick of all these finger quotes, but they're mighty necessary in the linguistically confused land of intellectual property, so get used to them. Anyway, again, with that increased treatment of copyright law as a moral principle rather than a pragmatic attempt to create new works, that comes with the lengthening of the term, this time to 21 years. I imagine you can see the unsurprising trend at this point. The more the ethical justification has drifted away from promoting additions to the public domain and towards excluding others from your intellectual property, the laws have reflected this by excluding ideas from that public domain for longer and longer. By modern times, I'm sure most people watching this will at least have some sympathy for the notion of owning an idea. Now, this is just the broader trend of history, as shown by a few very far separated examples. This trend can be seen in microcosm by looking at the history of US copyright law, which, by the way, is pretty much another way of saying world copyright law, but I'll get back to that. The US Constitution gives Congress the power to create copyright and patent law in Article 1, Section 8, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. As you can see, this appears to be a return to the more pragmatic justification, but when the actual IP laws were passed, oh yeah, I'm going to start saying IP laws because I'm sick of saying intellectual property over and over. When the actual IP laws were passed through Congress, they ended up just being a slightly altered version of the British copyright law that we discussed the inception of previously. One of the alterations made was the duration. Instead of 21 years, the duration of a copyright was 14 years, renewable again by another 14 at the end of that if you're still alive and kicking. So, between 14 and 28 versus 21, I mean, I'd call that a wash, at least initially. You see, this graph, this shows the term of US copyright over the years. As you can see, the trend is unflinchingly upwards. To get an idea of what forces exactly push it in this direction, let's take a look at the most recent increase. The Copyright Term Extension Act is commonly known as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. This is because at the time, Mickey Mouse was coming to the end of its term of copyright. The copyright on Mickey Mouse is, of course, worth an enormous amount of money. This put Disney in the position where they could justify spending anywhere up to that amount on lobbying politicians to extend the copyright term. So they did. At this point, I think you'll agree that Disney has made enough money from Mickey Mouse such that the original creation is sufficiently incentivized. I mean, their earnings from Walt's original creation has long since finished sending the message that if you design an iconic character like Mickey, you'll just be rewarded with all the money. There is not a single person who is going to look at all the money made by Disney and think, well, I would create a cartoon character, but I don't think a measly multi-billion-dollar award is worth the effort. The only justifications there could be for wanting to extend copyright any further for Mickey's sake would be either the moral justification, which I'll put to one side for the moment, we'll discuss that more later, or just plain self-interest. Disney had a cash cow they wanted to continue milking, and they had the cash already stockpiled that they could make sure they could continue to do so. I don't even really fault Disney for their behavior here. I mean, okay, I kinda do, but the real fault is with the copyright system, which makes what they did the rational decision given their self-interest. You might say that they shouldn't be so self-interested, but that doesn't take any blame away from the system which improperly managed the self-interest which is going to inevitably exist. Think about the company pushing that law change. Disney made its fortune making movies out of public domain material. Now they're using that fortune to change the law to prevent others from building on their work like they built on old books and fairy tales. And that crippling of people's ability to build on the works of others is just the first harm of IP law that you're going to have to account for if you want to justify the current legal situation. For another one, let's move back to patents. What about the higher cost of goods? You might like the idea of an inventor receiving his royalties, or more realistically, the inventor's company receiving royalties, but on the other end of that is now an additional cost of producing that good. And for as long as that patent exists, the good itself is going to have to cost more to justify that. For a good example, this TechDirt article talks about the cost of smartphone patents. IP law is adding an additional $120 to the average smartphone. That's average, mind you, not high-end. So at $120, that's literally more than half the cost of the phone going just to royalties. And that's just the direct royalties. That's not including the fact that since innumerable machines are needed to create the smartphone, that raises the cost of producing all of the components, making the true cost of patent law incalculably huge. The article also points out that our grotesque monster of a patent system has even spawned an entire industry of what's known as patent trolls. That's a company which buys up patents from failed startups, defunct tech companies, wherever they can get them, and then uses those patents to sue the crap out of anyone who they can argue is infringed on one of their vaguely defined patents. It's pretty hard to argue that the original inventors will be incentivized to do their inventing by the knowledge that if they fail to make a cent out of their invention and their company collapses, at least they'll be able to sell their patents for next to nothing to a group of slimy opportunists. So that's patent trolls. I also said that I would come back to the way that US copyright law is essentially world copyright law at some point, and this is as good a place as any to do so. Intellectual property ultimately requires a government punishing people for things that they do with their own property. Someone could be violating your intellectual property right now, and you would never even know. They could have arranged the zeros and ones on their hard drive in the same pattern as the zeros and ones on your hard drive. Perish the thought. And that is what's literally happening when you download something, anything. So if we want to police intellectual property law, we'll not only need to empower the government to check out what you're doing with your own property, but we'll also need to do that worldwide. What if someone on the other side of the world copied a song you wrote and isn't paying you? In the interest of this, pan-national organizations like the World Trade Organization, as well as various trade agreements, are increasingly having control over the laws of nations all over the globe. Let's say some of these arguments convinced you to advocate copyright reform where you are. Well, you'd better hope the previous administration hasn't locked you into an agreement to maintain certain copyright laws, because if so, your nation could face serious penalties for voting wrong. This is why, if I were an American, I'd be praising Trump for pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, because that agreement had stringent rules for intellectual property. New Zealand, by the way, doesn't seem to be so lucky. We're still in that fucking thing. However, the US is still a member of the World Trade Organization, which has a horrifying history with IP law. Here's a quote from their Investopedia article. One high-profile WTO, that's the World Trade Organization, controversy has to do with intellectual property rights and a government's duty to its citizens versus a global authority. One well-known example is HIV/AIDS treatments and the cost of patented medicines. Poor countries, such as those in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, simply cannot afford to buy these patented drugs. If they were to buy or manufacture these same drugs under an affordable generic label, which would save thousands of lives, these countries would, as members of the WTO, be in violation of intellectual property rights and agreements and subject to possible trade sanctions. Yeah, not pretty. Another harm caused by intellectual property law, as is indeed the case with all laws, is that people are going to have to be punished under it. If you want it to be illegal to download a song, then you need to be willing to fine or jail someone for doing it. That's a significant harm. And if you want to argue for stricter laws of any kind, you're going to have to justify it. I know it's tempting to write this off by saying, I don't care about harm I caused to criminals, but that is circular. You're meant to be justifying why it should be criminal in the first place. When you propose or defend any law, you need to weigh up the harm you're going to cause to otherwise innocent people in order to enforce it against the benefit that you intend to derive from establishing that law. So, what do we do in this situation, eh? The laws are causing untold problems and they aren't even directed towards their original intention of incentivizing new works. Well, a common suggestion is a return to the copyright laws of yore, to reduce the term of copyright and patent back down to something more manageable, to return the flow of works into the public domain back to some earlier level. Some others suggest that you should only be able to claim monetary proceeds that someone else makes from your ideas. For example, if someone downloads a song you wrote for personal use, that's fine. However, if they intend to use it in an advertisement or in a movie that they're directing or in some other way that would cause them to make money, you are entitled to some of that money. I, however, am an abolitionist. I believe that all intellectual property law is invalid and even harmful, and therefore I advocate repealing all copyright law, all patent law, and all other intellectual property law. That's probably going to need a little more explanation, so here we go. Before I get into my justification for the repeal of intellectual property law, I want to be clear about exactly what I'm advocating repeal of and what I'm not advocating repeal of. Namely, fraud. If you print and sell a copy of a book that I wrote, that should only be against the law if you put your name on the front cover. Anyone who buys that book from you believes that they are buying a copy of the book from the original author and thus incentivizing further creations of works such as that. And they are not. You are defrauding them. However, if you print it out with my name on it and with no claim that you are the original writer and the person buying it from you understands this, then no fraud has taken place. I just point this out because it's very common in my experience for those defending intellectual property to appeal to cases of fraud. If all of your examples of IP violation are actually just fraud, then consider that perhaps you're not against intellectual property, you're just against fraud. I just wanted to nip that in the bud before we get started. I'm not suggesting that we repeal all laws against fraud, I am suggesting that we repeal all patent and copyright and other intellectual property laws. Okay. But how will creators make money? You angrily type into the comments. Well, first of all, even if the answer to that is they can't, that's a terrible justification for a law. But I'll come back to that. First, I want to answer the question directly. How else could the intellectual property creators make money? Do what anyone in any normal profession does. Get people to agree to pay you before you do the work. If I sneak into a random fridge factory, use their machinery and materials to make some fridges, then go to the owners and say, "Pay me," they not only would not have to pay me, they'd probably call the cops. They could even go on to sell those fridges that I've made, and they still wouldn't owe me a cent, because if I wanted to get paid for my work, I shouldn't have performed it without securing an agreement from them that they would do so. The same goes for everything currently governed by intellectual property law. If I want to get paid for some music that I'm going to write, then I need to get someone to agree to pay me before I write that music. If you don't get that agreement, then nobody owes you anything. I mean, even if they benefit from your work, they don't owe you anything. Just like the factory owners don't owe the fridge-making bandit anything. People only owe you what they agree to pay you. This is not complicated, and it's also how it has worked before intellectual property law. For example, working on commission. That's Mozart's Lacrimosa. I'm sure most of you recognize it. It was famously commissioned by Count Franz von Walsegg in 1791 to commemorate the passing of his late wife. This is Rembrandt's The Night Watch. I'm sure most of you recognize it. It was commissioned by Captain Banning Cock and several members of the militia to hang in their banquet hall. This has been a normal means of funding art for most of civilized history. Someone who wants a piece of art created for some given purpose will pay for that to be done. Simple. Another common method of funding for the arts is patronage. That is Beethoven's Fifth. See those two names on the cover? Those are the two patrons to whom this work was dedicated. Between patronage and commissions, you have the funding method for most of the famous classical art and music that's so highly regarded. Also, for another example of patron-funded works, I present to you the video you're watching right now. All of the research, writing, performing, and meager editing were performed by yours truly, with nothing in funding beyond what is given to me by my generous patrons. If people like the work that you create, many will be interested in incentivizing you to create more of it. For example, if you want to incentivize me to make more of these videos, you can go to patreon.com/DannyDuchamp. Hey? Shill. Anyway, I should also deal with one objection. If there's no intellectual property law, couldn't someone just say they're me, set up a fake Patreon, and collect donations from people who are fooled? If that's your objection, I'd like to refer you to the earlier part in this video where I said that I am not against laws on fraud. The people who donated to the fake would be justified in taking the fake Danny to court, because they'd paid him money on the understanding that they were incentivizing Danny Duchamp to make more Danny Duchamp videos. Something which fake Danny had convinced them that they were doing. They were not, and they most likely would take him to court on that basis. I mean, these are people who are solely motivated by supporting some work that they enjoy, and in this hypothetical, they've been duped into not doing that. This support wouldn't necessarily take the form of direct donation, by the way. A creator of some kind of media could sell merchandise. That's another one. From popular online media to your favorite band, people's desire to have an authentic mug or t-shirt from the creator whose work they enjoy is well established as a lucrative enterprise. Maybe you think that I'm focusing too much on the artistic pursuits here. I mean, there are other things intellectual property is there to deal with. What about someone who's developing life-saving medicine? How does he get paid? Well, the first obvious answer is charity. I mean, that's already common. I mean, there are plenty of charities right now collecting for cancer research and the like. And before you say that charity can't really be a significant contribution to any industry, people are way too selfish for that. I'll quickly remind you that every year the US alone donates hundreds of billions. This shouldn't be surprising. Charity isn't just supported by generous individuals, but also by wealthy individuals and businesses who want to appear generous. Consider what happens during Breast Cancer Month, and every second product that you see seems to have 10% of proceeds go towards saving boobies. Another source of funding that's pretty similar to that last one is crowdfunding. It's a very simple version of refusing to do work until you pay me. I mean, the people pledge to pay you money if you do some kind of work. If enough people pledge money, you do the work and the funds are transferred. Think of the innumerable Kickstarter campaigns that you've seen on everything from video games to science experiments. Some of them rake in thousands, even millions in revenue, and even though our overgrown intellectual property laws are still in place as an alternative, they still manage to rake in those great sums. If those laws were reduced or eliminated, crowdfunding could expand to compensate. In fact, forget could, try inevitably would. I mean, if you're currently willing to drop $10 on the new album for your favorite band, it's not a stretch to say that you'd instead put that $10 towards the Kickstarter for that band's new album if they chose that method of funding. Moving right along, probably the most important incentive for research and technology is the first seller advantage. Businesses will always want to hire people to advance their technology because if you're the first one to market with a new development, then you have a distinct advantage in said market. You can be done ramping up your production while your competition is still figuring out how to incorporate your new ideas. Next up is advertising. You see, fundamentally, the how else will creators make money argument is what's known in economics as a public good argument. That's when there's a good which is non-excludable. Lots more of these. Non-excludable is when the creator of a good, once they produce it, can't determine who gets access to it. And so the argument goes, they can't charge for it. And then the argument goes after that because they can't charge for it, it won't be profitable and won't be produced on the market. We'll encounter a hefty walloping mountain of these public good arguments in the State of Excuses series. And they're always pretty dubious at best because they fail to take into account the complexity of the world. In the real world, there are always various ways to monetize things, even when the things themselves are non-excludable. A great example is radio broadcasts. Radio broadcasts are non-excludable. I mean, when you broadcast a signal from your radio tower, anyone with a radio can listen to it. You can't charge a subscription fee to people who want to hear it, because once a person pays for it, just one person pays for it, then anyone with a radio anywhere near the tower is going to be able to hear it without paying for it themselves. You need to start broadcasting once the first person pays for it, and then everyone's got it. According to the public good argument, this should mean that you can't monetize a radio broadcast. But of course, in the real world, we all know that you can. It may be non-excludable itself, and therefore a public good to the listeners, but to advertisers, it's perfectly excludable. If any advertiser wants to put their message on your broadcast, they have to pay. That strategy, mixing the non-excludable good with the excludable good of advertising, has not only been proven to have the capacity to fund almost the entire broadcasting industry, but it also has the proven viability for intellectual property. Right, sports broadcasters, they are sponsored by everything on the planet. Paid promotions on YouTube videos. By the way, if you're an advertiser on YouTube, I'm Danny Duchamp. No one wants... Anyway. Movies with product placement. Now, keep in mind that none of these methods needs to fund any entire industry. They can all often be used in tandem. Also, they don't all need to be used in every case. A big budget action blockbuster might be perfectly at home with the idea of characters openly drinking a Coke in a heartfelt indie film, though that might ruin it. That's fine. The indie film would make up for that because it's better situated to attract patrons, and in addition, it would probably have a lower budget anyway. So that's advertising. On to another one. Live exhibitions. I won't dwell on this for too long because it's pretty self-explanatory, but we all know that musicians get paid to perform their songs live. Non-fiction authors often get paid to do public speaking on the topic of their book. Visual artists will be paid to have their original work displayed in galleries. And keep in mind that artists will be paid to have their original work displayed in galleries. No one wants to go see a Van Gogh knockoff, at least not as much as they want to go see the original. The basic premise is if your intellectual property allows you to do any kind of live exhibition, then you display or perform that work in a building and don't let anyone in to see unless they pay you. And I'm still not done. You can also derive profit simply from having the celebrity status that comes with being a well-known creator of almost any type of intellectual property, whether you're some inventor of a fantastic new device, or an artist responsible for some culturally significant work. Talk shows will pay to interview you. Companies will pay to have you endorse their products. And any new enterprise that you start is going to have a whole lot more attention instantly directed towards it. You know, like Justin Timberlake starting up a restaurant, that kind of crap. Now, I'll never be able to even think of, let alone list, all the potential ways of monetizing intellectual labor without IP laws. But I've got to stop sometime. So I'll leave it there for now, because people might at this point be saying that, well, workers, artists, etc. can already use most of these funding methods on top of royalties from intellectual property law. But it's important to remember here that none of these methods needs to rival the money that is derived from the licensing of intellectual property. For one thing, this is because that these methods can work in tandem, as I mentioned before, but second, because we're not trying to fund an industry of patent trolls, remember? We just want to make sure that there are still incentives to innovate. But for another thing, these methods incentivize your next idea as opposed to letting you live off your old ones. If you want to keep ahead of your competition, the first seller advantage, for example, you need to keep innovating. You can't just come up with one innovation and then get fat off the royalties until the end of time. Maybe you'll persist, though. Sure, there are some incentives to innovate without copyright law, without patent law, but surely intellectual property laws will result in additional incentive and thus more innovation, right? Well, don't be so hasty. To say that the additional incentive of copyright and patents will result in more innovation, you would need to show that such incentive outweighs the innovation lost due to reduced capacity to build on one another's ideas. So how much is that? How much innovation do we lose while we're waiting for an idea to come into the public domain? How important is the ability to copy, share, and build on the ideas of others? Just how much of human creativity is that ability responsible for? In short, pretty much all of it. When we see an idea we like, we copy it, we share it, and if an improvement occurs to us, we add to it. This is the fundamental mechanism by which all technological, academic, and even artistic progress comes from. Now for a quick musical interlude. Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Landmark song in the development of rock and roll. Totally original concept, executed by a lone genius, right? Well, you knew I wouldn't be saying this if it was, so let's break it down. See, actually, No, not doing that joke. First, the chord structure. It's just a simple 12-bar blues. That's when you go chord 1 in your key for 4 bars, then chord 4 for 2 bars, back to chord 1 for 2 bars, then to chord 5 for 2 bars, and finally another 2 bars back on your home chord. I mean, that's a very stripped-down version of it anyway. Often it'll have an extra bar of chord 4 replacing bar 3 or 10, maybe jumping back to chord 5 at the very end on what's called the turnaround. Those various forms of the 12-bar blues weren't developed during the same era by coincidence. I mean, they developed the same way all ideas develop. People copying one another's ideas, sharing them, and occasionally, sometimes accidentally, adding their own variations. Don't think that it's just blues that has this commonly shared chord structure thing going on. There's this famous thing that the Lords of Awesome did, where they did every hit that you can think of from the last 100-odd years on only 4 chords. But it's not just chord structures that are copied and shared. The guitar licks and riffs in any song, including Johnny B. Good, are variations on what has come before. In this case, the intro there is basically a note-for-note recreation of Louis Jordan's Ain't That Just Like a Woman. Yeah, even the guitar tone with that distorted fuzzy sound, that wasn't original to Berry. That's all started when an accidental variation happened. Willie Kizart, the guitarist for a band called Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, had broken an amplifier on the day that they were planning to record, and they just decided to go with it.
You women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my rock.
And thus, distorted electric guitar was born, and among many other people was copied and adapted by Chuck Berry and Johnny B. Good. The structure also of Johnny B. Good is so common that I probably don't even need to give any examples. It's verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, and then end. I mean, that's possibly the most common structure for songs to have in modern pop music. You might be saying at this point, by the way, that, that Chuck Berry, he's a musical thief. But I could really do this with any song. Hell, if I were more versed in other art forms, I could probably do it with any other art form too. Copying with variation is just what creativity is. Let me go even deeper. So what about the scales? All of the music that is in Johnny B. Good is in the sort of like a blues scale. Within blues scales, the major and the minor kind of exist in tandem. But those major and minor scales that were merged together to sort of result in sort of the blues scale, they were developing for God knows how long in Europe, with influence from all over the world. No one person could possibly be credited with them. And hell, the specific notes in every scale in all of Western and pretty much all world music at this point, just 12 tones, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and then back to C. That's not some fundamental law of reality that those are the tones you have to use. I mean, ancient Indian music has a lot more, ancient Chinese music has a lot fewer, but that sort of the note system of 12 notes per octave, that was developed just gradually, culturally, evolutionarily. Okay, what about the lyrics to Johnny B. Good? The lyrics of Johnny B. Good are about a small-town boy of humble beginnings making it big through his music. I'm sure I don't need to give you other examples of this old-as-time aspirational trope, but what you might have not have noticed is that this is the setup for the classic hero's journey, also known as the monomyth. If you've not heard of that, it's the story told over and over about the humble hero who is called to adventure, then with the help of a mentor overcomes trials and temptations to win some decisive victory, learn or gain something of value, and then bring that back to the community. It has a lot of specific features which you can find in everything from Harry Potter and Star Wars to Odysseus and Jesus. Johnny B. Good is just the setup for it, but it includes certain crucial elements of the humble beginning in the country boy, the call to adventure through his innate musical talent, and even the mentor or helper in the form of his mother. This basic format, along with every aspect of every piece of art, has been developed for all of known literary history by, again, many people copying, sharing, and adding variations. One good way of showing that this is in fact how creativity works is to look at the phenomenon of simultaneous invention, also known as multiple creation. It's when inventions and advancements are made around the same time by multiple people entirely independently. Some of the more commonly cited examples are the 17th century independent formulation of calculus by Isaac Newton, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and others, the 18th century discovery of oxygen by Carl Wilhelm Scheele, Joseph Priestley, Antoine Lavoisier, and others, and the theory of evolution of species independently advanced in the 19th century by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. There's a list on Wikipedia of some of the more prominent ones, but it's obviously not complete. As the article itself points out, multiple discoveries are the rule, not the exception. The reason multiple creation or simultaneous invention occurs just so consistently is quite obvious when you look at creativity as a huge cultural evolutionary process as opposed to a lone genius magicking an idea out of nothing. If people have access to the same ideas on which to build, many of them will end up building the same things there. It's as the famous Isaac Newton quote goes, "We stand on the shoulders of giants," which is what Newton was doing when he adapted that phrase from Bernard of Chartres. And that little rhetorical device I just used there was adapted from the Kirby Ferguson documentary, Everything is a Remix, which, by the way, goes far more into depth with this topic. You should definitely check it out. In fact, I'll make it the first link in the description. Another way of showing how important it is to have giant shoulders to stand on is to look at what happens when people have little to no funding, but do have the ability to build on one another's work freely. Consider the open source software community. That's software that's written with no copyright or patents attached, so that you can just use it, add to it, do whatever you want with it, free of charge. If this doesn't sound like it could possibly result in much advancement, you're forgetting what we just discussed about how creativity works. Sure, there might not be as much incentive to work on open source software for any given individual, but there doesn't need to be. People still have good ideas and add it to the wealth of knowledge, often for no compensation at all. This process of many people adding little pieces every now and then has incredible results. You are without doubt using a lot of open source software right now. First, if you're watching this on YouTube, then you're getting the video streamed from Google's servers, which run on the operating system Linux, which was made without any help from IP laws because it's entirely open source. If you're watching it on some other site, then chances are that that website too runs Linux because Linux powers the largest share of web servers. Also, the server software running on all those Linux machines, as well as on pretty much every other web server in existence, is the open source Apache HTTP server. And perhaps you're using the Firefox browser to view it. Well, that's completely open sourced and uncopyrighted as well. Or perhaps you're using Google Chrome. That's based on an open source browser project called Chromium. Or perhaps you downloaded this video and are watching it locally with VLC Media Player. Great little player, right? Well, nobody got paid a cent beyond donations for that because, yep, it's open source. Or, I guess you could be watching this on your phone or your tablet. Well, the majority of those run Android, which is a custom distribution of Linux again, open source. Think about that. Consider the enormous wealth of a company like Google. It could afford to pay just about anything to get the best of the best in terms of software to work with, and yet it consistently relies on open source software. Clearly, the process of piecing software together from the efforts of countless unassociated people is tried and true. And it's not just software. For example, think of Wikipedia, possibly the most complete repository of human knowledge ever created. And, well, you know how Wikipedia works. But this shouldn't even be slightly surprising. We've established already that human creativity is collaborative and it's not really dependent on any one person's efforts. Getting stuff done with those ideas is... the server software might be patched together from the work of many, but the guy who creates and runs the server, he did that individually, so individually he's going to need to be incentivized to do that. That's why free servers aren't as widely adopted as free server software. But, of course, since the server itself is not intellectual property, but actual, real, physical property, the guy running the server doesn't need intellectual property laws. He can just charge for the use of the actual physical server that he physically owns. So, if you think I've been leading up to saying that incentives don't matter, you might want to re-watch the last couple of minutes of the video, keeping in mind that I am not saying that. All I'm saying is that, given how collaborative and evolutionary human creativity is, an increase to incentives to do collaborative work is not even worth a small reduction in our ability to freely copy, share, and build on the ideas of others. Therefore, if your goal is to get more technological, academic, and artistic advancement out of our society, intellectual property law is just not a good way to achieve that. All that said, however, I mentioned earlier in the video that even if intellectual property law really was necessary for intellectual work to acquire money, that isn't even a good reason to create said law. I don't think we should be writing laws so that specific people can make money. That's a surefire recipe for those with the ability to influence how our laws work to manipulate them in order to gain something for themselves at the expense of everyone else, including the people that the laws were originally intended to help. You know, the thing that has already inevitably happened? No, I think we should create laws to protect your person and other scarce goods. I want to go right down to the most fundamental scale at which we can analyze this: morality. When I said earlier in this video that the purpose of intellectual property has drifted in the minds of most from a pragmatic justification to a moral one, perhaps you thought that that was just fine. Perhaps you think that intellectual property is justified on a fundamental moral level. Well, if you want a full answer to that, you can check out my last video, My Foundational Philosophy, link in the description. But for a simpler description, think about how I described it earlier in this video, right? That this beer, in order for me to use it, I must exclude you from it. In order for you to use it, you must exclude me from it. Thus, we're going to have to determine, in some way or another, whose use it gets put to. Okay. Some kind of property rights are necessary. And I don't think that there's really anyone who had a significant disagreement with that. Well, I mean, let me deal with some of them. Maybe you think that we should democratically decide on who gets to drink the beer, but then the ownership is now split between all of the people who are allowed to democratically vote, and it is therefore owned by whichever body, democratic body, is determining its use. So it doesn't get rid of ownership, it just splits it up. It's unfortunately necessary, therefore, to make sure that everything is owned by someone. I don't think too many people are going to have an issue with that justification for ownership. All right. But then, for some reason, when we come to intellectual property, that all goes out the window. Right? Our justification for property was the fact that when I use a thing, you can't use that thing. That was the justification. If intellectual property doesn't do that, if I use your idea, that doesn't exclude you from using that idea, then it is not justified. When I download your song, you still have your song, so I haven't stolen it. When I make a pair of shoes that look just like your pair of shoes, I haven't stolen your pair of shoes because you still have them. You start serving a new cocktail at your bar, and I put that same cocktail on my menu as well. There is no property that has been transferred from you to me against your will, and therefore nothing has been stolen from anyone. Actually, that one wouldn't be illegal under our current law because intellectual property doesn't include cocktails. This is another good reason IP law can't possibly be based on some moral or ethical foundation. It's just so arbitrary what counts and what doesn't. What kind of loony moral principle could justify that? That's not entirely rhetorical either. I really want you to try to consider possible moral principles that could justify intellectual property. For example, is it wrong to just use ideas other people have come up with across the board? If so, then why doesn't this apply to cocktails, or recipes, or types of clothes? Or, if we're going to be consistent, mathematical principles? Does the entire world owe India half of our data because they invented the number 0? And why should we accept such a moral principle, even if you can develop a consistent one? Okay, so what other moral principle might be able to justify intellectual property? I've been pointing out so far that copying something is not the same as stealing it, because when you copy it, the owner still has it, but when you steal it, they don't. However, I'm sure a lot of you will have been trying to say that what's stolen there is the income that it deprives the original creator of. If I hadn't copied your invention and opened a competing business selling whatever you invented, then you'd be able to make more money out of it. Therefore, by copying your idea, I have deprived you of the income you otherwise would have made. The problem here is that this is also true of competition. If I open up a sushi restaurant next to yours, one could say that I deprived you of the money you otherwise would have made had I not opened that sushi restaurant. And it would be true, but it's perfectly fine. Competing with you is not the same as stealing from you. Even if you get more specific and say that the difference is that when I copied your invention and competed with you, I was depriving you of income by using your own work. I wouldn't have been able to make my business, or at least I wouldn't have been able to do it as easily if it weren't for you. But this could also be true of the sushi restaurant. Say you started your sushi restaurant in a new town where people hadn't tried sushi. They're all like, what the fuck is this? Raw fish? And so you needed to advertise and give out free samples to get people into it. Then when I open up my sushi place in the same town, people are just like, oh, hey, cool, a new sushi place. There's already a market for it, so I don't need to do any of the costly things you needed to do to create said market. I'm benefiting off your hard work and possibly putting you out of business in the process. But of course, this is still fine. That's just competition. You may see it as a little bit cold, potentially. I mean, if I was your friend, I might not want to compete with you, but there's clearly no consistent moral principle that would designate competition as stealing. So no, there is no consistent moral principle that intellectual property could be based on. Just to reiterate the most important point here, the entire justification for property in the first place is that things are scarce, and intellectual property is not scarce. Once an idea is created, it is infinite. Okay, so hopefully I've explained that adequately at this point. Intellectual property is not property. Infringing on intellectual property is not theft. Intellectual property law does result in actual thefts, as well as jailings and other terrible harms. And intellectual property isn't even necessary to incentivize new ideas in the first place. I'm Danny Duchamp, and that is the state of excuses for intellectual property law.